The British were moving through the hedgerows with careful precision, each man covering the next, their spacing perfect. Professional. Controlled. They look like they know what they're doing. So do we, Hayes said, but there was a question in his voice. Morrison didn't answer. He was thinking about Omaha Beach, about the chaos and terror and desperate scrambling. These British troops moved like they were on parade, even here, even now. It was different. He couldn't say if it was better or worse, just different. By mid-morning, Morrison's platoon had moved 2 miles inland and encountered British forces 3 more times. Each encounter followed a similar pattern: careful identification, brief exchange, continuation. The British were polite, efficient, and utterly unruffled by the war happening around them. It was starting to unnerve the Americans. Private First Class Tommy Chen, a radio man from San Francisco, put it into words during a break in a farmyard. "They're too calm," he said, watching a British squad brew tea, in the ruins of a barn while German artillery rumbled in the distance. "Don't they know we're in a war?" The British had set up a small stove, produced tea from somewhere, and were passing around metal cups while their sergeant studied a map. One of them was smoking a pipe. A pipe. Morrison had seen men smoke cigarettes under fire, sure, but a pipe suggested leisure time, contemplation, a Sunday afternoon. "Maybe that's just how they are," Morrison said. "It's weird," Chen insisted. "We're all jumping at every sound, and they're having a tea party." A British soldier, a corporal, stocky and middle-aged, overheard and walked over, cup in hand. "Fancy a brew?" he asked, offering the tea to Chen. Chen took it, sniffed it suspiciously. "Is this really tea?" "Course it's tea. What else would it be?" "I don't know. Medicine? Fuel?" The British corporal laughed, a short bark of amusement. "You Yanks and your coffee. Can't function without it, can you? We're the same with tea. Keeps you steady." He tapped his temple. "Settles the nerves." Chen sipped the tea, made a face. "It's hot. That's rather the point." Morrison accepted a cup when it was offered. The tea was strong, bitter, nothing like the sweet iced tea his mother made back in Virginia. But it was hot, and the British corporal was right. There was something steadying about it, about the ritual of stopping, brewing, drinking, continuing. The British had been at war for 5 years now. Maybe this was how you survived that long. You made tea, you kept routines, you stayed human. "How long you been fighting?" Morrison asked the corporal. "Since 1940. Dunkirk, North Africa, Sicily, now here." The corporal said it flatly, without pride or complaint, just facts. "You?" 2 days. The corporal studied Morrison's face, then nodded. "You'll get used to it. Or you won't. Either way, keep your head down and your rifle clean." He finished his tea, collected his cup, and returned to his squad. Hayes leaned close to Morrison. 4 years of combat, and he's brewing tea in a barn. Either they're crazy or we are. "Maybe both," Morrison said. The differences became more apparent as the day wore on. Morrison's platoon was attached to a British company for a push toward a crossroads 2 miles south. The British captain, a tall, thin man named Pemberton, briefed the combined force with the same tone Morrison's high school principal had used when explaining detention policy. Calm, measured, slightly bored. "The objective is this crossroads," Pemberton said, pointing at his map. "Jerry's got a machine gun position here, possibly a mortar team here. We'll advance in 2 columns, suppress the machine gun, and clear the position. Questions?" Morrison raised his hand. "What if they've got more than 1 machine gun?" "Then we'll suppress both," Pemberton said, as if this were obvious. "The key is to maintain formation and not bunch up. Jerry loves it when you bunch up. Makes his job easier." Morrison had a dozen more questions. What about flanking fire? What about reinforcements? What about artillery support? But Pemberton had already moved on, issuing orders to his platoon leaders with the same unhurried precision. The British soldiers listened, nodded, checked their weapons with practiced efficiency. No one seemed nervous. No one seemed excited. They just seemed ready. The American platoon leader, Lieutenant Kowalski, pulled Morrison aside. "What do you think?" "I think they've done this before," Morrison said. "So have we." "Not like this. Not 4 years' worth." Kowalski frowned. "You think we should follow their lead?" Morrison considered. The British approach was methodical, careful, almost cautious. The American way, at least how they'd been trained, was to hit hard and fast, overwhelm the enemy with aggression and firepower. Different philosophies, different experiences. "I think we should watch and learn," Morrison finally said. The advance began at noon. The British moved forward in textbook formation, each squad covering the next, using every bit of cover. They moved slowly, too slowly, Morrison thought at first. His instinct was to rush, to get across the open ground quickly, but the British took their time, and as they moved, Morrison began to see why. They never exposed themselves unnecessarily. They used the terrain perfectly. When they encountered resistance, they didn't charge forward. They stopped, assessed, brought up support weapons, and suppressed the enemy position before advancing. It was like watching a machine operate, each part moving in coordination with the others. The German machine gun opened up when the lead British squad was 50 yards from the crossroads. The squad immediately went to ground, returning fire while their sergeant called back coordinates. Within 30 seconds, a British mortar team had ranged the position. 3 rounds later, the machine gun stopped firing. "Advance," Pemberton called, and the British moved forward again, same pace, same precision. Morrison's squad followed, trying to match the British rhythm. It felt unnatural. Morrison wanted to run, to get to cover quickly, but he forced himself to move at the British pace. Hayes, beside him, was breathing hard. "This is taking forever," he muttered. "But we're not getting shot," Morrison pointed out. They reached the crossroads 15 minutes later. The German position was abandoned, the crew having pulled back when the mortars found them. The British immediately set up defensive positions, sent out patrols, and established a perimeter. No celebration, no relief. The door opened. Hitler stood there in his nightshirt, his hair uncombed, his face puffy with sleep and irritation. He was 54 years old, but looked older in that moment. His skin sallow, his eyes struggling to focus. "This had better be important, Jodl." "Mein Führer, the invasion has begun. Normandy, multiple landing sites, airborne drops inland, naval bombardment. They're coming ashore now." Hitler stared at him. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, he just stared. Then his expression changed. Not to alarm, not to shock, to something else entirely. His eyes sharpened. His mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but suggested satisfaction. "So," he said, "they've finally done it. They've shown their hand." He turned back into the room, leaving the door open. Jodl followed. Hitler walked to the window, looking out at the Bavarian Alps in the morning light, his hands clasped behind his back. "Normandy," he said. "Normandy. Not Calais. Interesting." Jodl waited. He knew better than to interrupt when Hitler was thinking. Outside, the mountains stood silent and perfect, utterly removed from the chaos unfolding 700 miles to the west. Birds sang. Somewhere below, a dog barked. The war felt very far away. "It's a feint," Hitler said finally. "Obviously. They want us to commit our reserves to Normandy, then they'll launch the real invasion at Calais. The Pas de Calais, that's where it makes sense. Shortest crossing, closest to Germany. This is Eisenhower trying to be clever." Jodl had the reports in his hand. He'd read them 3 times. The scale of what was happening in Normandy didn't match a feint. Thousands of ships, thousands of aircraft, airborne divisions dropped behind the beaches. But Hitler was already moving, getting dressed, calling for his adjutants. "Get me the latest reports, everything, and get me Keitel. We need to assess the situation properly before we commit anything." That word, commit. Jodl felt something cold in his stomach. The Panzer divisions, the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Jugend, positioned near Lisieux, the Panzer Lehr Division near Le Mans, both units within striking distance of the Normandy beaches, both units ready to move, both units waiting for authorization that only Hitler could give. And Hitler, now fully dressed in his uniform, was smiling. Actually smiling. This could be perfect, Jodl. If this is their main effort, if they've committed everything to Normandy, we can destroy them there. Crush them on the beaches, drive them back into the sea, show the world that Fortress Europe cannot be breached. The morning briefing began at 10:30. By then, more reports had arrived. The invasion wasn't slowing, it was expanding. 5 separate landing zones now identified. Utah Beach on the Cotentin Peninsula. Omaha Beach, where American troops were fighting through murderous German fire but still advancing. Gold Beach, Juno Beach, Sword Beach, where British and Canadian forces were pushing inland. Paratroopers had secured key bridges and crossroads behind the beaches. Naval gunfire was systematically destroying German coastal positions. Hitler listened to all of this, standing at the map table, occasionally asking questions. How many ships? Impossible to count, the reports said. Hundreds at minimum, perhaps more than 1,000. How many aircraft? The skies were black with them. Allied air superiority was absolute. How many troops ashore? Estimates varied, but by noon the number was climbing past 50,000, then 70,000, then higher. And Hitler kept returning to the same conclusion. Calais. They're saving their main strength for Calais. This is too obvious, too expected. Rommel himself predicted Normandy as a possible landing site. That's exactly why they won't make it the real invasion. They know we're ready for it. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, was on the telephone from his headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, outside Paris. He was 70 years old, a Prussian officer of the old school, and his voice carried the weight of 4 decades of military experience. "Mein Führer, I must request authorization to move the panzer reserves toward the landing zones. Every hour we delay allows the enemy to consolidate their beachhead." Hitler's response was immediate. "No, not yet. We need to see their full hand first. If we commit, the panzers to Normandy and the real invasion comes at Calais, we'll have nothing left to stop them. Mein Führer, with respect, the scale of this operation." "I'm aware of the scale, von Rundstedt. I'm also aware of British deception capabilities. Remember the dummy tanks before El Alamein? Remember the false radio traffic? They're masters of this. We will not be fooled." The call ended. Von Rundstedt, 700 miles away, stood in his headquarters and said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to his chief of staff. He's going to let them establish themselves. He's going to give them the time they need. But von Rundstedt was wrong about one thing. Hitler wasn't giving the Allies time out of indecision or weakness. He was giving them time because he genuinely believed he was being clever. He believed he was seeing through their deception. He believed that patience now would allow him to spring the perfect trap later. By early afternoon, the numbers were undeniable. Over 100,000 Allied troops were ashore. German commanders in Normandy were screaming for reinforcements. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit close enough to reach the beaches without Hitler's authorization, had launched a counterattack toward Sword Beach and been stopped cold by British anti-tank guns and naval artillery. The division commander reported that without massive reinforcements, the beachhead couldn't be eliminated. Hitler's response, when it came, revealed everything about how he saw the situation. Tell them to hold what they have. Contain the beachhead. don't let it expand. But we're not committing the reserve panzers. Not yet. Jodl tried once more. Mein Führer, if this is the main invasion, it's not. But if it is, it's not, Jodl. Use your head. Look at the map. Calais is 120 miles from London. Normandy is over 200. Calais is 150 miles from the Ruhr, our industrial heartland. Normandy is 300. Calais has the best ports. Normandy's ports are either too small or too heavily fortified. From a strategic standpoint, Normandy makes no sense as the main invasion point. Therefore, it isn't. The logic was perfect. The logic was also completely wrong. But Hitler had built his entire world view on the belief that he understood strategy better than his generals, that his intuition was superior to their conventional military thinking. He'd been proven right before. France in 1940, everyone said his plan was too risky, and he'd won in 6 weeks. The Soviet Union in 1941, everyone said don't invade, and he'd nearly taken Moscow. His track record of defying military convention and succeeding had made him certain of his own genius. And so the panzers sat, and the Allies kept landing, and the beachhead kept growing. By evening, the numbers had climbed past 120,000 troops ashore. The Allies had linked up several of the landing zones. They'd pushed inland in places, 2 or 3 miles, even 5 miles in some sectors. They'd secured the port of Corseul. They'd captured Bayeux. The beachhead was no longer a toehold. It was a foothold. Soon it would be more. Hitler ate dinner that evening in the Berghof's dining room, surrounded by his staff and several guests who'd been invited before the invasion began. The conversation was almost normal. Someone mentioned the opera. Someone else discussed the latest production figures from the aircraft factories. Hitler spoke about his plans for rebuilding Berlin after the war, the grand boulevards and monuments. He seemed relaxed, almost cheerful. Only once did he reference the invasion. "They've made their move," he said, cutting into his vegetarian meal. "Now we'll see how it plays out. I suspect within a week we'll be hearing about the real invasion. Then everyone will understand why we held back our reserves." Across the table, an aide who'd just come from the communications room sat very still, a piece of paper in his pocket. The latest estimate, 140,000 Allied troops ashore. The number had been climbing all day. By midnight, it would exceed 150,000. He didn't mention it. Neither did anyone else. The dinner continued. That night in Normandy, the Allied beachhead was roughly 10 miles wide and in places 3 to 5 miles deep. Over 156,000 troops were ashore, exactly the number that would later be recorded in the history books. They'd brought tanks, artillery, supplies, thousands of vehicles. They'd established field hospitals, ammunition dumps, command posts. They'd captured dozens of German strongpoints. They'd taken thousands of prisoners, and the panzer reserves that could have hit them while they were still vulnerable, still organizing, still establishing their positions, sat motionless, waiting for authorization that wouldn't come. Hitler went to bed that night still believing he'd made the right decision, still believing Normandy was a diversion, still believing the real invasion was yet to come. The next day, June 7th, brought more of the same. The beachhead expanded. More troops landed. More supplies came ashore. The Allies pushed inland, taking villages, securing crossroads, establishing defensive positions, and Hitler continued to hold back the panzers. It wasn't until June 8th, 2 full days after the invasion, that he finally authorized the movement of some reserve units toward Normandy. Not because he'd changed his mind about Calais. He still believed the real invasion was coming there. But the situation in Normandy had deteriorated enough that he couldn't ignore it entirely. He released some units, but not all. He kept substantial forces near Calais, waiting for the invasion that would never come. By then, it was too late. The Allies had established air superiority so complete that German units moving in daylight were slaughtered from the air. The panzers that Finally did move toward Normandy took days to get there, traveling only at night, hiding during the day, losing vehicles and men to Allied fighter bombers. When they finally reached the front, they arrived piecemeal, in small groups, too weak to launch the kind of massive counterattack that might have driven the Allies back into the sea. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded Army Group B in northern France, had been away from his headquarters on June 6th. He'd been in Germany, visiting his wife for her birthday, convinced that the weather was too poor for an invasion. When he got the news, he'd raced back to France, driving through the night. He arrived on June 7th to find the situation already critical. Rommel had spent months preparing for this invasion. He'd placed obstacles on the beaches, mined the approaches, positioned his forces to respond quickly. But his plans had all assumed that when the invasion came, he'd be allowed to use the panzer reserves immediately to hit the Allies while they were still vulnerable on the beaches. Hitler's decision to hold back those reserves destroyed Rommel's entire defensive strategy. On June 9th, Rommel sent a message to Hitler's headquarters. The tone was carefully respectful, but the content was blunt. The situation in Normandy was deteriorating. The Allies were consolidating their position. Without massive reinforcements, without the full commitment of the panzer reserves, the beachhead couldn't be eliminated. Every day that passed made the Allied position stronger. Hitler's response came back the same day. Hold what you have. Contain the enemy. The reserves will be committed when the situation clarifies. Rommel read the message twice. Then he turned to his chief of staff. He still thinks Calais is coming. He's going to wait until it's impossible to stop them. He was right. Hitler's conviction that Normandy was a feint lasted for weeks. Even as the Allies poured more divisions into France, even as they broke out of the beachhead and began pushing toward Paris, Hitler kept substantial forces near Calais, waiting for an invasion that existed only in his mind.